It started with tire tracks that didn't belong on my land. The crunch of gravel woke me before the sun even cleared the ridge. It was exactly 8:03 a.m. when the first engine roared past my window. I didn't even need to look, I already knew who it was. Olivia Pierce. HOA president and self-appointed authority over everything she could see from her manicured cul-de-sac. The smell hit next, burnt rubber and damp earth. Fresh ruts cut straight through my ranch gate like it was nothing. Again. I stepped outside with my coffee still steaming in my hand. The heavy metal gate hung crooked on a single, mangled hinge. The chain was snapped, and the lock had been twisted open so hard it looked like it was done by hand. Beyond it, a white SUV bounced over my private dirt road, heading downhill toward the neighborhood like she owned the place. Like I didn't even exist. That was the 7th time that week. Not a mistake. Not an accident. A calculated pattern. I crouched down and ran my fingers through the dirt. It was still damp from last night, soft just under the surface. Most people would have missed it. I didn't. You don't spend years working Texas land without learning how it breathes under your feet. I looked up toward the ridge where their homes sat in perfect, suburban rows, with clean driveways and sprinklers ticking like clockwork. Every single one of those green lawns depended on a utility system they never thought about and never saw. My phone buzzed. An HOA notice. I didn't even bother opening it. I already knew what it would say. Asterisk community access. Shared benefit. Asterisk the exact words entitled people use when they want something that isn't theirs. I took another sip of coffee. It tasted bitter now. Then I watched a second car, and then a heavy commercial garbage truck contracted by the HOA, rumble through the broken gate like they had every right in the world. Olivia was stepping things up, routing neighborhood services through my land to shave 3 minutes off their schedules. That was when I made my decision. I wasn't going to fix the gate. Not yet. I wasn't going to argue, call a lawyer, or waste time explaining property lines to someone who had already decided. They didn't apply. I just stood there, quiet and still, and watched the road carve itself deeper into my land with every passing tire. Because what Olivia didn't know was simple, that stretch of dirt she kept driving over wasn't just empty ranch land. And it was definitely not harmless. Underneath that road was something far more valuable than a shortcut. Something that fed her entire neighborhood. Something I owned. For the first time all week, I smiled. Not because I was angry, but because I finally saw exactly how this was going to end. I didn't repair the gate that day. I left it hanging just enough to look neglected. That was the first mistake they made. They thought I didn't care. By 9:15 a.m., I'd counted 12 vehicles cutting through my land. Tires carved deeper into the same path, compressing the soil with every pass, making it easier for the next one. The ground was changing slowly, quietly. Exactly how I needed it to. I walked the length of the trail they'd created. It stretched nearly a quarter mile across my property, a straight, efficient, completely illegal line. I stopped halfway down where the earth dipped just slightly. Most people wouldn't even notice it, a shallow basin about 40 feet wide and maybe 6 inches lower than the surrounding ground. But I knew what sat beneath it. I'd installed it years ago, a highly engineered, lined irrigation reservoir vault. It was connected to a main system that fed not just my ranch, but every green lawn and filled pool up on that ridge. Their entire neighborhood depended on it. And right now, that underground vault was under immense pressure. Not from water but from weight. I pulled out my phone and opened my monitoring app. Numbers flickered across the screen: soil density, moisture levels, load distribution. All within acceptable range. For now. I scrolled back through 5 years of historical data. Every inch of this land was mapped. Every seasonal shift was documented. That was when it became clear they weren't just trespassing. They were accelerating a catastrophic structural fatigue. Something incredibly expensive. I heard another engine rumble behind me. I turned slowly to see Olivia's SUV again. Same speed. Same unearned confidence. She didn't even slow down when she saw me standing there, just threw up a quick wave through the windshield like we were neighbors sharing a driveway. Like she'd already decided this dirt was hers. I stepped aside and let her pass. Gravel snapped under her tires, and the ground flexed subtly beneath the weight. It wasn't enough to alarm her, but it was enough for me to feel the shift through my boots. That subtle give. That quiet movement. That was the moment I stopped seeing this as a nuisance. This was leverage. I spent the rest of the morning making quiet calls to engineers, surveyors, and Daniel Whitaker, a sharp property attorney who owed me a few favors. I didn't explain the whole plan. I didn't need to. I just asked the right technical questions. What happens when repeated vehicular load exceeds soil tolerance over a lined irrigation basin? What does liability look like when unauthorized access causes structural compromise to a private utility? The answers weren't immediate, but they didn't need to be. I already knew where this was going. By noon, I finally opened the HOA notice while standing in the shade of the broken gate. It was exactly what I expected. Formal, arrogant language declaring the path across my rancha. Proposed community access easement due to historical continuous usage. No consent. No legal standing. Just pure bluff backed by arrogance. I read it twice, then I laughed. Not loudly, just enough to feel it settle in my chest. They weren't just cutting through my land anymore, they were trying to claim it. That changed everything. I folded the notice carefully and slipped it into my pocket. Evidence. Intent. Documentation of overreach, all neatly handed to me by Olivia herself. I looked back down the path. More cars were lining up now. The traffic was steady, predictable, and reliable. Exactly what you want when you're building a case. Or setting a trap. Because what Olivia and her HOA didn't understand was simple. This wasn't just dirt they were driving over. It was heavily regulated, fully insured infrastructure. And it was devastatingly expensive to repair if something went wrong. If it failed, the liability wouldn't stop at a broken gate. It would cascade through municipal contracts, insurance policies, and right into the pockets of every homeowner who depended on what ran beneath their tires. I checked the app one last time. Moisture levels were rising slightly, and soil integrity was dropping by a fraction. Nothing dramatic. Not yet. But it was enough to confirm what I needed. This was no longer about stopping them. This was about letting them continue just long enough for the consequences to become completely unavoidable. I slipped my phone back into my pocket and walked away from the road, leaving it wide open and inviting. Sometimes the most effective move isn't to block the problem. It's to let it grow until it exposes itself. And when it does, there's no argument left. Only consequences. By the third day, they weren't just using the road, they were entirely dependent on it. The line of cars started before sunrise, their headlights cutting across my pasture like a moving fence of white light. I stood on the porch with a fresh cup of coffee and counted 23 vehicles before 8 a.m. No longer random. Routine. Predictable. Exactly what I needed. The ground told the rest of the story. The path had deepened by nearly 2 inches, showing raw compression lines running parallel like scars. The basin in the center had started to darken as moisture was squeezed up through the topsoil. Subtle, quiet, but growing. I walked out there right after the morning rush cleared. My boots sank slightly into earth that used to be bone-dry and firm. I crouched and pressed my palm against the surface. It was cool and damp, holding far more water than it should. That meant the engineering lining underneath was starting to strain under the multi-ton pounding of their commuter traffic and those heavy HOA maintenance trucks. Not failing yet, just reacting. Exactly on schedule. My phone buzzed again with another HOA message. This time it wasn't a notice, it was a formal warning. They claimed I was obstructing community efficiency by allowing my gate to fall into disrepair. I read that line twice. Community efficiency, that was their justification now. Not safety. Not necessity, just pure convenience. 3 minutes saved had somehow mutated into a legal entitlement. I typed out a furious response, then deleted it. There was nothing to say. Words would only slow this train down. Around noon, a black pickup pulled up near the gate. It wasn't a resident. A man in his mid-40s stepped out with a clipboard and began snapping detailed photos of the gate, the ruts, and the tire tracks. I stayed back near the barn and watched. He didn't see me, but I recognized the logo on the side of his truck, an HOA contracted surveyor. That meant Olivia wasn't just using the road anymore. She was actively documenting it to build her legal case for the easement. It was a bold move, and incredibly reckless. Because documentation works both ways. I pulled out my phone and checked the system. The data had shifted dramatically overnight. Load stress was now flagged outside the optimal range in 2 separate zones, and moisture levels were up another 3%. Still not critical, but trending fast. I tapped into the master control panel, the advanced admin screen most people didn't know existed. Flow regulation, pressure balancing, emergency override. These were systems designed to protect the reservoir from catastrophic damage, systems I hadn't touched in years. I stared at the controls for a long moment, then adjusted one setting. Just slightly. Not enough to trigger automated municipal alarms, but just enough to allow natural hydraulic pressure to redistribute more freely beneath the surface. It was a tiny change on paper, but in reality, it accelerated the countdown clock. The sun climbed high, baking the top layer of soil. From a distance, the road still looked solid, dry, and safe. That was the illusion. Underneath, it was shifting, expanding, and preparing. I walked back toward the house and paused at the broken gate. The chain swung slightly in the breeze, a wide-open invitation. I left it exactly as it was. Fixing it now would end this, and ending it now would mean they'd walk away with nothing more than a corrected bad habit. That wasn't enough. Not after they tried to claim my land in writing. This needed to reach its full, crushing consequence. I glanced up toward the ridge. Sprinklers running, lawns emerald green, everything functioning perfectly. For now. They had no idea how fragile their comfort had just become, or that the guy they thought they were bullying had already adjusted the very system they depended on. Olivia believed she was turning a trespass into a right. What she didn't understand was that every car crossing my land was just adding weight, pressure, and massive legal liability. And when that balance finally tipped, it wouldn't just be my problem. It would be theirs. All of it. By the 4th morning, the pattern was engineered by sheer repetition. The first car came earlier than ever. 7:12 a.m. headlights cut through a low, heavy fog sitting across the basin. The air smelled different today. It was heavier, a mix of wet clay and a strange metallic scent from deep beneath the surface. I stood at the edge of the path and listened. Tires didn't crunch the gravel the same way anymore. The sound was soft, dull, and wet. The ground was starting to absorb the vehicles instead of resisting them. That was a terrible sign for them. I checked the app before my coffee even cooled. Soil compression had reached a historic threshold, and moisture retention had spiked another 5% overnight. The system was fighting back. The underground pumps were working double time to balance the pressure beneath the reservoir lining. I walked down to the lowest point of the basin. My boots sank nearly half an inch this time. The surface still looked intact from a distance, but up close, fine, spiderweb-thin cracks were forming where the soil was trying to stretch and settle simultaneously. Another SUV rolled through behind me, slowing down significantly as its tires dipped into the soft section, then kept going. No alarm, no caution, just a slight adjustment of the steering wheel, and they were gone. They were finally starting to notice the give in the road. Not enough to stop, but enough to hesitate. And hesitation always comes right before the crash. Around mid-morning, a heavy commercial utility truck bearing the HOA's maintenance logo entered the path. 2 men inside drove halfway down and stopped right near the basin. One of them stepped out, nudged the cracked soil with his boot, and glanced back toward the homes on the ridge. I stayed out of sight behind a line of fence posts and watched. They talked for a minute, nodded, got back in the truck, and drove right through the mud. No cones. No warning signs. No attempt to block traffic. That told me everything I needed to know. They saw the structural hazard, and they chose convenience anyway. That single decision was going to cost their entire community more than they could fathom. My phone buzzed with a sharp, red alert banner, subsurface pressure imbalance detected. I opened the app. The numbers were moving fast now, trending heavily in a direction that only ends one way. The lining beneath the basin was flexing far beyond its optimal tolerance. It was still functioning, but it was pushed to the brink. I could still stabilize it. One tap on the screen, one override command, and the system would redistribute the hydraulic pressure and lock everything safely in place. It was the responsible option. I stared at the blinking control for a long moment, my thumb hovering over the screen. Then, I slid the phone back into my pocket. This was no longer just about infrastructure. This was about accountability. They'd been warned by the gate, the mud, and the visible cracks. Yet they still drove through, still documented it, and still tried to claim what wasn't theirs. The sun climbed higher, drying the top layer of dirt just enough to hide the chaos happening underneath. From the ridge, everything looked normal. Cars moving, lawns green, utilities running. But beneath that illusion, a massive amount of pressure was building in ways they couldn't see. I walked back toward the house and stopped at the gate. The chain swung slightly in the breeze, a quiet, inviting rhythm. I left it exactly that way. It wasn't a shortcut anymore, it was a trigger. And every single car passing through was pulling that trigger one step closer to a disaster they wouldn't be able to ignore. The fifth morning didn't begin with engines. It began with an eerie silence. I stepped outside at 7 a.m., and for the first time all week, there were no headlights cutting through the fog, no tires on gravel. Just a heavy stillness. The air was thick and humid, completely defying the dry forecast. I walked toward the path, my boots pressing into soil that felt like wet sponge. The basin had transformed overnight. The surface looked smooth at first glance, but as I got closer, I saw a major, subtle sag. The center of the path had dropped nearly 2 inches, catching the morning light like an open bowl. I crouched down and pressed my hand into the dirt. Muddy water instantly bubbled up around my fingers. The engineering lining beneath was no longer distributing the pressure. It was ballooning upward under the hydraulic force. The system had compensated as long as it could. Now, it was just waiting for either immediate relief or total failure. I looked up toward the ridge and saw why it was so quiet. A massive line of at least 15 cars had formed at the top of the path. Parked, idling, and completely frozen. They were staring down at the sagging earth I was standing on, paralyzed by uncertainty. Right in the center of that line was Olivia's white SUV. She stepped out slowly, her arms crossed tight over her chest, surveying the situation like it was a minor inconvenience rather than a severe structural failure. I stayed exactly where I was and let her process it. After a minute, she started marching down the slope toward me, her designer boots ruining themselves in the mud. By the time she reached the edge of the basin, her face was set in pure dismissal. She stopped 10 feet away, glared at the bubbling mud, and then looked at me. "You need to get your tractor out here and fix this," she commanded. Not a question, not a request. An order. I let the silence stretch between us, letting the full weight of the past week settle in. Then I spoke, my voice entirely flat. "It's holding." Olivia frowned. "It doesn't look like it's holding. It's still within operational tolerance," I replied. That technical term caught her off guard. She didn't understand it, and she didn't like it. She took an angry step closer, too close. Her high heels sank deep into the soft, saturated clay near the edge, making her violently lose her balance. She scrambled back quickly, a flash of genuine uncertainty crossing her face before it was replaced by sheer frustration. "This is exactly why we filed for that easement," she snapped. "This access road needs to be graded and maintained properly by a crew that actually cares." I almost smiled. It was perfect. She still thought this was just a road. She still thought this was about simple maintenance. She genuinely believed this was my problem to solve for her convenience. I pulled my hands out of my pockets and looked her dead in the eye. It is not a road, Olivia. She stared at me for a second, then shook her head like I was being completely unreasonable. It is now, she said. She turned around, stormed back to her SUV, threw it into drive, and pulled forward. The front tires rolled onto the softened basin, and the ground dipped heavily under the multi-ton weight. Then the rear tires hit, and the earth groaned, sinking even deeper. It still wasn't enough to stop her, though. She roared through the broken gate and onto the main road. Behind her, the line of cars began to move again, one by one, blindly following her lead, her assumptions, and her catastrophic mistake. I stood there and watched the weight return, the pressure rebuild, and the system beneath them adjust one last time to a force it could no longer manage. Olivia hadn't just ignored a warning, she had validated a pattern of willful destruction. And once a pattern like that is locked in under extreme stress, the final outcome is no longer a possibility. It's just a timeline. It happened at exactly 7:41 a.m. Not with a massive crash, but with a deep, hollow, terrifying shift beneath the earth, the kind of vibration you feel in your bones before you actually hear it. I was already standing near the barn when Olivia's SUV rolled over the soft section again on her return trip. Her tires pressed down, and for a split second, the ground held. Then, the topsoil simply split from the warped rubber lining below. With a wet, gasping sound of displaced air, the center of the basin collapsed into a deep sinkhole. Olivia's front tires dropped straight into the pit, the undercarriage of her SUV smashing violently against the subterranean concrete vault with a horrific crunch of tearing metal. The car behind her slammed on its brakes, sliding sideways into the mud. A chain reaction of panic and slamming brakes echoed up the ridge. My phone vibrated violently in my palm. It wasn't a soft alert anymore. It was a red system notification. Critical system failure, reservoir liner breach, automated shutoff engaged. The numbers on the screen went haywire as thousands of gallons of pressurized water began to geyser upward through the sinkhole, flooding the undercarriage of Olivia's trapped vehicle and turning the entire path into a rushing, muddy river. Olivia scrambled out of her driver's side door, her face completely pale as she stared down at her ruined vehicle and the rushing water. She turned toward the line of trapped cars behind her, waving her hands frantically to stop them, but it was far too late. The path was completely obliterated. I took a deliberate step back, calculating the distance as the ground continued to ripple and settle around the breach. Several drivers abandoned their vehicles entirely, while others tried desperately to reverse up the slick, muddy slope, destroying what was left of my pasture in the process. My phone screen updated with a final, cold message: system integrity compromised, manual intervention required. I could have hit the remote bypass valve days ago to prevent this. I didn't. And I wasn't going to touch it now. At this stage, turning off the water wouldn't fix the root problem. It would only delay their accountability. Within minutes, the entire illegal road was completely underwater, a massive pool of mud and pressurized runoff tracing the exact lines of their repeated trespass. The system beneath them had crossed from minor damage into total failure. Olivia picked her way through the rushing mud toward me, her voice cracking with pure panic. "What did you do? You sabotaged this road. You're responsible for this." I didn't raise my voice. I just unlocked my phone, held it up, and recorded the geyser, the trapped cars, and her standing in the middle of the destruction she had authorized. "I didn't do anything, Olivia," I said over the roar of the water. "Your HOA contracted trucks and residential traffic destroyed the structural ceiling of a state-regulated utility reservoir vault. A private infrastructure system you were formally warned about in writing. The illusion was entirely gone. Every sensor reading, every timestamp, and every recorded instance of their unauthorized load was safely stored on my server. All of it traceable, and all of it pointing back to her single, stubborn decision repeated over and over again." I turned away from the flooded basin. Olivia believed she had proven the road was theirs to use. What she had actually done was trigger a multi-million-dollar failure condition in a utility asset she didn't own. And once a system like that enters failure mode, the next step isn't repair. It's an investigation. An investigation leads directly to liability numbers that most people aren't prepared to see attached to their names. By the 7th day, the entire ranch community felt different. The air carried a thick, legal tension that didn't belong in a quiet Texas neighborhood. I stood by my fence line early that morning and watched the county trucks roll in. They weren't rushing, they were precise, parking exactly where they needed to be. Surveyors stepped out first, slamming bright orange regulatory markers along the exact perimeter of my property line. Neighbors came out of their homes up on the ridge, huddled together in worried groups. A sleek black SUV pulled up behind the county vehicles, and Daniel Whitaker stepped out in a sharp press suit, holding a legal folder thick enough to end a corporate career. He gave me a single nod. That was all we needed. Across the street, Olivia's front door flew open. She marched down her driveway with her phone raised like a weapon, looking annoyed before she even knew what she was looking at. She headed straight for the county workers like she owned the dirt they stood on, her voice carrying sharply across the gravel as she demanded names, authority, and immediate answers. The lead surveyor didn't even look up from his digital transit. He just handed her a certified, state-stamped cease and desist order. Olivia glanced at it for 2 seconds before her expression shattered, confusion, then disbelief, then real, unbridled panic. She started talking faster, her voice dropping an octave as she turned toward Daniel, pointing a finger at him like he was the villain in her story. Daniel listened without interrupting, then calmly opened his folder and handed her a second document. This one took her a lot longer to read. Her shoulders dropped just a fraction, the very first crack in her armor. The paperwork explained everything: the state-protected utility easement running beneath the road, the strict access rights tied to private utility infrastructure, and the massive civil penalties triggered by unauthorized interference with a secured utility boundary. The ranch gate she kept smashing through wasn't just a simple fence. It was a legally recognized secure access point tied to critical land use infrastructure. Every single time she forced her way through, she hadn't just violated my property lines, she had violated a chain of municipal agreements connecting the HOA, the county, and a private utility network that I happened to legally own. Olivia tried to argue, her voice shaking as she claimed the HOA board had approved the access route. Daniel didn't even blink. He simply pointed to the signatures at the bottom of the state documents, the HOA's legal signatures, and Olivia's own name, approving policies and utility disclosures she had clearly never bothered to read. The exact same disclosures that gave her power on the ridge were now executing against her. More vehicles arrived, not police, but state compliance officers, agricultural forensic teams, and financial insurance adjusters. This wasn't a neighborhood dispute anymore. It was a structured legal correction. Neighbors gathered closer, whispering and staring at Olivia like she was the star of a horror movie she hadn't realized she was filming. Her confidence completely faded in real time. She made 3 frantic phone calls, but nobody came to save her. There was nothing left to argue. The system she used to bully others was now running her over. I leaned against my fence and took a slow breath. This was never about shouting or proving a point in the mud. It was about letting the right pressure build in the exact right places. Olivia finally looked across the flooded road at me, and for the first time since this started, she didn't look angry. She looked completely broken. She was finally starting to understand that the gate was never the real boundary. The real boundary was ownership, and she'd been crossing it for weeks without realizing who actually stood on the other side. The numbers arrived long before the physical consequences became visible. That's how systems like this always work, quiet first, then completely overwhelming. By noon, official legal couriers had delivered identical, heavy white packets to every single address connected to the HOA. Not just Olivia. Everyone. Because liability in a shared residential governance structure doesn't stay isolated, it spreads like a virus. I watched as neighbors stepped outside, holding envelopes they never expected to see. Some looked confused, some looked terrified, and a few were already throwing furious glances across the street at Olivia. She was still standing in her driveway, reading the exact same page of Daniel's folder over and over again, as if the numbers might magically change if she stared long enough. They didn't. The preliminary structural assessment was officially locked in: structural compromise of a Class A protected subsurface system, mandatory engineering stabilization required, environmental compliance penalties triggered, and immediate, indefinite vehicle restriction enforcement. And then came the line that actually mattered: total estimated stabilization and repair cost, $7.40 million. The number ripped through the neighborhood faster than any wildfire. Conversations turned frantic instantly. This was no longer a minor neighborhood inconvenience. This was a catastrophic financial event that could ruin their lives. A white truck bearing a state environmental seal pulled up next, representing the one layer of authority Olivia never saw coming. Regulatory oversight doesn't care about HOA bylaws, neighborhood status, or personal opinions. It only cares about forensic data. The officers placed heavy concrete barriers across the entrance of the path. No vehicle access. No exceptions. The exact same restriction Olivia had tried to bully me out of was now being enforced on her entire neighborhood by the state. A state investigator approached Olivia, asking a single, devastating question: who authorized repeated commercial and residential vehicle traffic over a marked, protected utility zone? Olivia opened her mouth to speak, then stopped. Because there was only one truthful answer: she did. And there was a massive paper trail to prove it: security footage, sensor data logs, and her own pinned text messages in the HOA group chat explicitly telling residents to ignore my gate and use the shortcut. Every single petty decision she made to feel powerful had stacked up into an undeniable criminal liability. By mid-afternoon, the second wave of bad news hit the neighborhood. The HOA board members were called into an emergency executive session, and phones were ringing off the hooks. Lawyers and insurance providers were flooded with calls, and that's when the absolute worst-case scenario occurred: the policy exclusions. * willful negligence. Unauthorized use of private infrastructure. Direct disregard of posted utility restrictions. * the exact legal language that turns an insurance policy into a worthless piece of paper. The insurance providers issued a blanket denial of coverage. The financial burden stayed exactly where the decisions were made. Olivia tried to regain her footing, shouting over her fence that the warnings were unclear and that no real structural damage had been proven. Daniel didn't even interrupt her. He simply handed the state investigator the full digital sensor report from my app: load frequencies, soil displacement tracking, and progressive structural failure modeling. It proved the damage wasn't hypothetical. It was already happening, and it was directly caused by her unauthorized traffic routing. The investigator read it, nodded once, and turned back to Olivia, his tone completely flat. "Ma'am, you are now officially listed as the primary target in a state utility liability investigation. Once your name is legally attached to a number like $7.4 million, everything changes." The system was doing exactly what it was engineered to do: apply crushing pressure right where it belonged. Olivia looked around at her neighbors, the same people she had ruled with absolute confidence just days ago. Now, they were looking back at her like she was an anchor dragging them into financial ruin. She wasn't in control of the situation anymore. She was trapped inside it. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument Olivia Pierce had ever won in her life. It didn't hit all at once. It settled slowly over the ridge, like dust after a structural collapse. By the next morning, the neighborhood had changed in ways that could never be undone. The concrete barriers remained in place. The state vehicles were still parked along the fence line, but the real shift was in the way the residents looked at each other. Conversations were short, quiet, and terrified. Everyone finally understood that this wasn't an HOA dispute anymore. It was a life-altering financial disaster. The emergency HOA board meeting lasted 6 agonizing hours, and not a single soul walked out smiling. By the time the votes were tallied, Olivia Pierce was no longer the president. She hadn't resigned. She had argued, screamed, and insisted she was being unfairly targeted. But the board voted unanimously to strip her of her position and her authority in a single motion. But losing her title was the easiest part of what she faced. When critical infrastructure fails, the legal response is brutal and highly structured. A formal liability report was issued within 48 hours, translating her arrogant behavior into direct, unpayable costs. The $7.4 million was no longer an estimate, it became a projected legal obligation. Primary personal liability was assigned directly to Olivia Pierce, with secondary exposure levied against the HOA as a collective entity, which meant every single homeowner on that ridge now had a massive financial stake in her downfall. That was when the real legal civil war began. Quiet filings started hitting the county courthouse. Several residents filed massive class action claims against the HOA for gross negligence. The HOA, in a desperate bid to save itself, countersued Olivia personally to recover every single dollar of the damage tied to her written orders. With the insurance companies totally out of the picture, the financial avalanche had nowhere else to go. It landed squarely on her doorstep. I watched the entire collapse from the exact same spot I'd stood since day one, my fence line. The boundary that started this whole war. Only now, nobody questioned why it was there. Daniel stopped by my truck one last time before the weekend, handing me the final, certified state engineering report. Everything was perfectly aligned, documented, and closed. He didn't say much, and he didn't need to. The system had done its job flawlessly. Olivia's house went on the market exactly 2 weeks later. It wasn't by choice. The listing price dropped by $100,000 in the first week, then dropped again, driven down by the desperate urgency of mounting legal fees and court-ordered asset freezes. The neighborhood meetings continued without her, under a completely rewritten set of strict bylaws. Access restrictions were no longer treated as suggestions. They were heavily enforced by private security. Nobody ever drove across the basin again, and nobody ever questioned my gate, not because of me, but because of the terrifying cost attached to ignoring it. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the Texas ridge, I walked back down to the central basin. The surface had been completely stabilized, reinforced with commercial-grade concrete vaults, and beautifully restored to a condition 10 times stronger than before. You could stand on it now and see absolutely nothing wrong, no mud, no cracks, and no visible sign of the trap that had sprung beneath their feet. That's the thing about engineered systems. They recover, they rebuild, but they never forget. Every line of code, every sensor reading, and every failure remains in the logs as a permanent reference for the next decision. I rested my hand on the heavy steel fence post and looked up at the quiet houses on the ridge one last time. This was never about a broken gate, and it was never about a 3-minute shortcut. It was about boundaries that exist whether people choose to respect them or not. Olivia Pierce thought that power meant control over others and the freedom to take what wasn't hers. What she learned too late is that real power is ownership. And ownership doesn't ever need to raise its voice. It only needs to wait until the exact moment when the cost of ignoring it becomes completely impossible to deny.